So I was asked on my Facebook page how to avoid masking. And so I wanted to do a quick video where I showed you 3 different techniques I commonly use to avoid instruments getting in the way of each other. So masking occurs when one or a set of instruments is getting in the way of something else. And what most people attribute masking to is overlapping frequency content. And whilst this is appropriate sometimes, masking can occur for many reasons, and just EQing certain frequencies out of some instruments is not necessarily the best way to solve masking problems. So to just demonstrate this, I just wanted to show you what a difference just balancing the tracks out just a little bit can do. And this is one of the big problems I find, is people just rush to EQ very quickly, and just by moving the faders around a little bit they could achieve the same results less destructively and therefore end up with a more natural result. So if we look on this track, I've loaded a trim plugin up to every single channel, and if we flick through them, this is just doing some kind of gain changes. And this is just so that by turning all of these trim plugins on and off, you hear the difference between something that is slightly less balanced and something that has been balanced. The idea being, if you don't spend enough time balancing before you start mixing and understand how the jigsaw puzzle is meant to fit together, then you can end up over-processing everything. So I'm just going to play you 5 seconds with and 5 seconds without. So hopefully what you heard there is that everything felt like it had more space. I let the percussive instruments, like the kick and the snare, kind of have more peak level so that they kind of pushed up over the instruments. And then the things with the sustained energy didn't have to necessarily be quite so loud. And then the instruments that are kind of leading everything, which are these 2 kind of sets of synth parts, if you look at the trims on these, I've actually turned these up, okay? The idea being that I want to hear those more. And by creating the pumping in the drums of the movement of it coming to the forefront and then slipping back behind, and the synths driving things more, you have created more space. And if you were to look at a lot of these kind of sweepy sounds or these impacts, I've turned a lot of these down because they were kind of more supplemental parts that needed to be in the background. And by doing all of this, I've kind of created more space for what I deem to be important. So this will go a long way to solving your masking problems, but it won't completely fix everything. So once you've kind of balanced things out, you should have a really good idea about what are the important elements in the track and what are not so important. And then when it becomes a case of trying to work out, well, how do I clear some masking? Well, the general approach would be is to remove some elements that you don't need out of the more superficial sounds, out of the sounds that are going to be more in the background, and clear space for the important elements. Okay, and you know, this is one of the big things about masking, is that if you start taking away from everything or trying to put some tracks that you're boosting one frequency area and cutting from another one, you just end up in a little bit of a mess and it doesn't sound as natural as it could. So my approach with this sort of thing to get rid of masking is more of a subtractive approach, and it's definitely more on the supplemental instruments. So let's just have a quick listen and kind of pinpoint a few things. Okay, so what I hoped you noticed there was that as it was playing through, when I felt like there was some competition or I was getting a good grasp on what frequency areas that were potential problems, I started muting instruments. And that was just a way of knowing if I mute it and the problem goes away, that's likely to be the main culprit. Now, I was muting instruments that were less important. There's no point muting a lot of the instruments that are meant to be really prominent, because they're the things that you want to focus on anyway, and they're the things that need a broader range of frequency content usually too. So I was muting these pads and finding that gave you more space for these synths. And there's definitely a balance to be made by taking some frequencies out of these pads to allow the synths to come forward. And that's generally better than trying to add frequencies to the synth to try and make that come forward and leaving the pads as they are. A subtractive approach is usually more natural to our ears, and it also kind of creates more headroom, whereas being additive kind of removes headroom. Now, the exception to that is when you want something quite coloured. If you want to colour a sound, then an additive approach might be quite good. But in this case, I'm just trying to clear space. And another good technique here is that when you're finding masking, it's often good to do this in mono, because when everything is folded down and everything is on top of each other, that's when these relationships really kind of are made obvious. And there are a couple of ways to do this. You could simply just take your mix bus and then have it panned in the middle. Or a preferred method for me is to go through to the mix bus and put a plugin on and something where you can kind of make it go to mono. So by reducing this isotope imager to one band and turning the width of it down to minus 100, that's going to be mono. So just have a listen. So you could hear that going in and out of mono. And another thing here is that actually some things that seem like masking are not. So here, when we're in mono, I feel like we lose too much of the ambience, and you expect to lose stuff that's really extreme and that to kind of go down a few dBs, but I feel like we're losing too much. So let's go ahead, and I just want to kind of turn up these ambiences so that when it's in mono like this, we're not losing so much, and we might find that the synths naturally just kind of come forward more that way. So the ambience there feels a little bit better, the space feels like more defined, and that was just noticed by going into mono. So now let's go ahead and let's fix this pad issue. So what I was hearing there was like a brighter sound on this one that was just kind of poking through. So let's just turn this on and off. And then that leaves more space. And then on this particular one, I felt like there was this kind of low-mid kind of boxiness. So that was quite dramatic. Now let's put those in and out, and also let's put it back into stereo after. So that might be quite subtle to you, but we've just opened it out, just given it a little bit more breathing room. And that was to me even more obvious when we ended up in stereo. So I've gone ahead and removed those plugins that we added because I want to show you another method of doing this, a kind of more visual way. So if you're having real problems, then you can always rely on this to help give you some guidance. So I've picked two of these instruments that are kind of competing with each other. And let's just add an instance of Pro Q3 by FabFilter onto both. And what we can do now is we can make the analyzer show the spectrum of both instruments simultaneously. So at the moment, by default, it only shows itself. So let me just play that, and you'll see on this particular instance the spectrum analysis of pad 1 coming on. Okay, so you see this kind of grey outline to show that's the track it's on. And if we go back to the analyzer here and we click on Synth 2 Bounce, now we should see both. And the one that's not the channel that we're looking at will be in a reddish colour. And hopefully you notice like a little red column coming down, and that's actually indicating masking. So if you look down here, you'll see that it shows you any collisions that are occurring. So what we can do here now is we know that's the area where the collisions are occurring, and we can take some of that frequency area out in the less important instrument. And we've ended up with this kind of cut, and I believe that's right around the same sort of frequency areas that I was hearing anyway. So that's showing you a kind of different approach to this. And sometimes you'll find that these collisions aren't a problem and you take it out and everything kind of sounds thin. So, you know, don't just see collisions occurring and just think that you have to remove everything. This is definitely a case of making small incremental gains across a large number of tracks, and that all of a sudden opens everything else out. Okay, so the final approach is to use compression, okay? And actually this is my favorite of the three, because I think that this is the one that people really reject more than they should. And what's important to me when we're thinking about how sounds interact is we consider how they're reacting over time. So it's kind of a little bit more intuitive to think about, well, certain frequencies are overlapping, or, oh, let's change the balance a bit so that one's louder and one's quieter. But this complex relationship of frequencies and time and how sounds kind of interweave with each other and one takes over from another is a little bit less intuitive, initially, until you start hearing it. And then once you start hearing it, you're never going to be able to unhear it. So let's just have a listen to the track, and we'll pick something to do. So really what I want to happen is to have more kick. And what I feel is like the sustain of the bass and the rumbliness of the bass is just getting in the way. And we don't want to get rid of the low end energy out of the bass, because that's going to end up making everything sound thin. But if we can remove some of those low frequencies, or just some of the bass overall, whenever there's a kick drum, we might be able to make more space for the bottom end of that kick to develop, and for us to be able to feel that weight of that kick drum and more of the punch of it without it being masked. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bus here where all the bass synths are going to go to, and the bass guitar. Okay, and I'm going to just load a compressor on here, and I'm just going to pick a simple compressor, the Waves R compressor. Okay, so now I've got a compressor on there, but instead of just compressing the bass, I only want to compress the bass when there's a kick drum there. So I'm going to go ahead, and on this kick channel, I'm just going to send that to bus 3 pre-fader. And I'm going to do the same to the sample kick, because they're kind of playing slightly different rhythms, so I need to make sure both go into there. And then from there, I'm going to set the key input here of this compressor to be on bus 3. So what this means is when you use a key input on a compressor, that's basically saying that the detector circuit on the compressor is responding to a separate input rather than the audio signal that's being compressed. And this is called sidechaining. So what we're going to do here is we're going to play with the compression, and the settings don't really matter so much at this point in time. The main thing that I want you to pick up on is the fact that whenever the kick happens, the bass ducks out the way, and the bass ducking out the way means that we hear more of that low end develop in the kick. So hopefully what you're hearing there is that you get more of that low end weight of the kick drum coming in, and what it does is it actually gives more bounce and momentum to the whole track that way. It's slightly lumpy at the moment, probably because there are some instances where the kick and the kick sample are in at the same time, and that doubles the amplitude. You can see here that we've got the sample kick and the live kick, but we don't have the live kick here, so it's reacting unevenly to those different inputs. And what I'd do in this case is I'd actually make a dummy kick track, probably with something transient like this natural kick, but on all the beats, and we're not hearing that in the mix, but that's just kind of triggering the compression. Okay, now if you didn't want to stop there, you could take this a stage further, because for me the only place where you've got a problem is in the low frequencies. So rather than just compressing the whole bass, Well, how about we only compress the low frequencies of the bass, and maybe we can be a bit more extreme with it without actually hearing it. So let's try this. So I've loaded this FabFilter multi-band compressor here, and we've keyed it from the same bus, and now it's going to be triggering, but only up until 267 Hertz. So what we've done there is we've done some compression, but we've actually turned up the bottom end of the bass. But because it's not getting in the way of the kick so much, we've actually got time to let the kick have low end and the bass to have low end. And this is just a brilliant technique to be able to kind of make different things fit together. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.